Battlefront 3, the white whale of Star Wars games. For over a decade, fans have been trying to piece together its story and gameplay via leaks, but this latest discovery offers the most definitive look we'll probably ever get. A brand new leak has surfaced, revealing the most complete version of Battlefront 3 we've ever seen. This build, running on the Wii, dated November of 2008, shows just how far development had progressed before LucasArts cancelled the project only a few weeks later. And in this video, we're going to take a deep dive into this new discovery, comparing it to the earlier 360 build, and try to imagine the game that could have been. Also, a huge shout out to the Free Radical Archive for acquiring the developer kit containing this build and making it accessible to the community. Okay, so Battlefront 3 was going to have a big emphasis on the single player campaign, so let's start by taking a look at it. For those that don't know, the story was going to follow X1 and X2, a pair of clones secretly created from the DNA of Jedi Master Fallon Gray by the Kaminoans. The story has the player control X2 and starts in the final days of the Clone Wars, with the two brothers stationed above Tatooine under the command of General Feroda. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I will be comparing this new Wii build to the 360 build, which leaked back in about 2012. That build, dated April of 2008, was much earlier on in the development, around 8 months behind the new Wii build. And if you are curious about the 360 build, I did cover it in a video last year, so feel free to check that one out. And for those of you who are wondering if the Wii version is just an upscaled build of the Elite Squadron game we would end up getting for the PSP, it's not. This is pretty much identical to the flagship version, apart from a slight downgrade in graphics. Okay, back to the campaign. The tutorial level is optional, but it does introduce the basic controls along with the seamless space-to-ground combat mechanic, which would have been unique to Battlefront 3. And the great thing about this new build is that most of the tutorial level is actually playable, unlike in the earlier build. This time you start with some light starfighter gameplay before hopping inside a dropship and going down planetside. As you fly by, you can see all the different clone trooper garrisons training down below. The two brothers then get diverted to rescue a group of clones who have been ambushed by Tuskens outside town. This acts as a tutorial of the combat controls. After fighting back the Tuskens, X1 and X2 hop on a speeder and race back to town. Oh cool, a Sarlacc pit. Hello there. Oh well, at least we know the developers got around to modeling the inside of the Sarlacc pit. The tutorial level ends with you switching to Feroda and taking on a rogue Rancor in a boss fight. This would act as a setup to the Jedi levels in the third act of the game. And overall, I think this is one of the best openings to any Star Wars game that I've ever played. Free Radical tried to pack it with so much content, from flying in space to going down planetside to getting into some classic Battlefront style combat, riding a speeder, and finally playing as a Jedi against a classic creature. And I'm glad to say things only got better from there. The first proper level is set in the main town area of Tatooine and is designed to show off Battlefront 3's main gameplay loop. The Separatist forces have attacked Tatooine and it's time for the Clone Brothers and their garrison to push them back. Now this level is really similar to the one from the 360 build, but this time with several new additions. Just like the older version, you start on the ground blasting a few droids, but now you also grab a rocket launcher and use it against these droid gunships. This is followed by a section where you get into the orbital cannon and shoot down a few dropships. The cannon mechanic is actually different in this version, letting you follow the missiles and alter their trajectory slightly. We then grab a dropship and blast off into space, where we dock in the hangar of the Acclamator. You then grab one of the starfighters and fly over to the droid control ship, where you recreate the ending of episode 1 by flying deep inside, blowing up the core and bailing right before it blows up. The next level takes place on Coruscant and starts with X1 and 2 being awarded a medal for their valor by Palpatine, who is no longer just some floating robes. We also get the first hints of X1's dark side tendencies as he flirts with the Chancellor.
Identical, but separated, if only by a few hours. Perhaps more.
Unfortunately, this is cut short as the Separatists attack the planet. What follows is this really cool level on Coruscant with the battle raging both on street level and up above. Now, this being a Wii version, there is a graphical downgrade when compared to the 360 build, but this is still really impressive for a Wii game. There's plenty of action on the ground and the skies are absolutely filled with Republic and CIS ships. The objectives of this version are very similar to the earlier build. You start by pushing back the droid forces on the ground and regrouping sleeping with the Jedi. Look at this, typical Mace Windu just standing around not doing anything. At least Yoda tries to contribute, but oh my god. Poor guy, the Clone Wars really did do a number on him. This version also has a lot more dialogue and character moments like this one between the droids.
Roger, Roger. No, I'm XJ11. He's Roger. Okay, Roger. No, he's Roger, not me.
The second half of the level has the two brothers jump into starfighters and infiltrate one of the droid control ships. They were supposed to disable the ship's comms, but instead they decided to sabotage its core and blow it up, which results in a big-time bollocking from Mr. Blue Man Group.
Your orders were to disable the cruiser's comm, not destroy the entire ship.
The next level takes place on Cato Neimoidia. We now get a working cutscene which shows more of a growing rift between the two brothers.
Enough talking. It's a disgrace. The Jedi know what they're doing, do they? And do you know why you think that? Because they told you to.
This level starts the same as the older build with a flyby of the city as you destroy the turrets, only this time in starfighters. You also fly inside one of these tubes which holds up the city and blow up the shield generator from the inside. The rest of the level is very similar to the 360 build. You land, fight your way through the city into Newt Gunray's palace and disable the droids right in time for Order 66.
Hold your fire! X2, stop! The Jedi are not your enemy! You tried to kill my brother! Only in self-defense! You just murdered most of our platoon! I had no choice!
Neither do I.
And the level ends with a boss fight against Feroda. Only this time, X2 has this Viberblade stick thing instead of blasting him in the face with a shotgun. Under the rule of the new Empire, the two brothers become Jedi hunters. And this new build actually has somewhat of a working version of a cutscene where Vader sends them down to hunt down a Jedi on Dantooine. But on the way there, the rift between the two brothers just becomes too great and X2 decides to bail.
You traitor!
Now, the older version of this level was very much incomplete and would crash early on. However, the Wii build has the entire level playable, and most of it centers around X2 helping the villagers fight back against the Empire, using AT-STs, tanks, and turrets. And these villagers sure are grateful.
Hooray! Woo! Hey! Hey!
Also, this time around, the developers actually had some time to add code to the villagers' logic, so they don't run around like lemmings like they did in the older build. The Dantooine level also introduces this really cool looking walker called the AT-XR, which kind of reminds me of Ed 209 from RoboCop. Eventually, X2 meets Fallon Gray, the Jedi he was supposed to hunt down. It turns out Fallon Gray is actually the Jedi from whose DNA the two brothers were cloned. Unfortunately, X1 arrives and cuts short their father-son bonding time. Angered by the betrayal, he kills X2 and wounds Fallon Gray, but the Jedi Master gives the last of his life force to revive X2, and then dies. The game's second act picks up about a decade later and sees General Cato recruit X2 away from his life of, digging dirt to become a member of the Rebel Alliance. Now, Cato was supposed to be the bridge between Battlefront 3 and The Force Unleashed, which were developed concurrently at LucasArts. And it's really nice to see this in-universe synergy that harkens back to the classic Star Wars EU. The following level is also supposed to be a bit of a tie-in to The Force Unleashed. In his first mission for the Rebellion, X2 works to sabotage one of the Death Star's super lasers being assembled at the Desolation Station. What's cool is that the Death Star itself is actually floating in the skies above, and it's a lot bigger and closer to what it looked like in The Force Unleashed when compared to the earlier build. Other than that, the Desolation Station level is very similar to the older 360 build. You infiltrate the facility, free the Wookiees, and then go up to blow up the laser. The next three original trilogy levels are pretty similar to their early build versions, only this time with more objectives and a bit more polish to them. We start with the Yavin level, which takes place right after the destruction of the first Death Star and has you help the rebels evacuate the base. This level also introduces X2's love interest, Shara Vale, a former bounty hunter who has joined the rebellion.
I thought all the clones went up with the Death Star.
This build includes a lot more cutscenes which actually develops their relationship further. This version of the Yavin level also has models for Luke and Wedge inside the main base. The level ends with this really nice escape sequence which has you fly out of the base and head straight into the atmosphere, where you fly right through the debris and then the guts of the destroyed Death Star. Next up is the Battle of Hoth level, which has X2 lead a group of rebels as they defend Echo Base. But this build actually has R2 and 3PO, the latter being voiced by Anthony Daniels.
Don't think I've forgotten about what you did to the princess clothes.
The hangar also has a Chewie model next to the Falcon. This time around you can actually ride the Tauntauns, unlike in the earlier build where you just had to push them along. The Tauntauns also do this little dance while they wait to be ridden. Of course, this wouldn't be a Hoth level without a snowspeeder section, and in this build you can actually harpoon the walkers instead of just shooting confetti at them like in the old one.
It's all harpoons and tow cables these days.
However, the biggest new addition to this version is the encounter with Vader. About halfway through the level, X2 is cornered by the Dark Lord, and it's up to you to try and escape before he chokes you to death. The level ends with X2 escorting a rebel transport off planet, then landing inside a Star Destroyer when he and Shara fight their way to the power core and sabotage it, causing the ship to blow up. You've probably already noticed that a lot of these levels end with you landing on a big ship and blowing it up. Speaking of which, the Endor level takes place during the climactic battle in Return of the Jedi. It starts on the ground with the giant Death Star overhead. You free the Ewoks and then battle your way through the forest until you reach the bunker just in time to see it blow up. And you can also catch Han running out of there. Han, where are you going? Han? No, he's just decided to clip through the floor. You blow up an AT-AT, then hop on a speeder and race through the battlefield across a lake until you reach your X-Wing. You hop inside and fly straight to the giant Death Star. And again, even 15 years later with all the Wii downgrades, this still looks really impressive. Another thing to note is that this build has a lot more bonus objectives. For example, on Endor you can either fly directly into the Death Star or help Lando in the Falcon.
Somebody say General Lando?
Right, so we land in the hangar, great parking job from me, take out the Imperial forces and protect Shara while she extracts some secret Imperial data. The interesting difference between this and the older build is that there's no more Imperial guards in the Wii version of the throne room. X2 and Shara then manage to escape just before Lando blows up the Death Star, which ends Act 2. The story then picks up a few years later on Cloud City with X2 and Shara helping Lando get it back from the Empire.
Get in, get out. Works every time.
X2 has now been trained in the Jedi art by Luke, which means the gameplay style and perspective has changed. You no longer point the Wiimote at the screen, at least not whilst holding a lightsaber, which means no more free camera movement. But from what the guys at Free Radical told me, there were plans to implement various different control schemes for the Wii. X2 now also has a bunch of force powers which were missing from the older build. We've got force push, pull, stun, saber throw, and repulse. Apart from that, the Cloud City level is pretty similar to the older build. You blow up a Star Destroyer by dropping a mini platform on it, then land on the city itself, rescue Lobot, and escort him into the city's main computer. And the level ends with a showdown against some Dark Troopers. The next level is set on Dathomir, well actually it's set in the Star Destroyer graveyard just above Dathomir. This time with you piloting an A-Wing instead of a Y-Wing. And this level flips things around. You start off by blowing up the shields and the core before going down planetside. X2 helps the rebels take out the stormtroopers and then attempts to gain access to the secret facility, only to run into a Rancor. Unfortunately, the Rancor is just too strong for X2, so he uses his Jedi powers to access the debug menu and spawn in an AT-ST. With that out of the way, X2 infiltrates the facility where he and the rebels discover that X1 has been up to all sorts of dark side shenanigans.
They did a lot of testing. Wookiees, then stormtroopers, trying to alter them.
The level ends with X2 taking on a bunch of Night Sister clones. Meanwhile, Luke and Wedge go to Mustafar to investigate X2's Imperial base. You get this really nice cutscene where Luke is sensing all the terrible things that happened to his father on this planet.
I have failed you, Anakin. I have failed you.
Unfortunately, they do end up getting ambushed by X1 and his army. Wedge, I hate to tell you this, but you're not actually holding anything. Luke fights back, but ends up being captured, with X1 intending to use him as a base for his new clone army. X2 gets wind of this and gathers the New Republic fleet and mounts a full-scale attack on Mustafar. Unfortunately, they can't go down planetside because X1 has a shield over his base. So naturally, X1 lands on a damaged Star Destroyer, makes his way to the bridge, and uses it as a a spearhead to crash into the shields. As you can see, these cutscenes were still pretty early on. Now, the Mustafar level has seen the most changes between the 360 and the Wii build. You see, in the older version, this was actually the penultimate level of the game. X2 was going to keep Luke prisoner and take him to Kashyyyk, where the New Republic and Imperial Remnant would have one final battle, which would culminate in a duel between the two brothers. But in the 8 months between the two builds, LucasArts decided to cut the Kashyyyk level and end the campaign on Mustafar, and so the Mustafar map was reworked. After landing on the planet, X2 and Shara push back the Imperial forces, X2 infiltrates the base and confronts X1 for their final duel.
You are broken. Kessel Prison will hold the pieces.
You never did know how to finish anything.
And so, X1 gets the Norman Osborn death, Luke is no longer forced to be a sperm donor, and our heroes live happily ever after. Credits. And personally, I think this is one hell of an amazing campaign. It's over the top and filled with fan service in the best kind of way. It's so epic in scope, encompassing the prequels, the original trilogy, and even the expanded universe. Sure, the levels do tend to rely on go up into space and blow up a big control ship trope, but the game does a really smart thing by dressing that up in different set pieces from all across the saga, making for a really fun experience. But this build also had several other modes apart from the campaign, most of them in pretty good working condition. It has the Conquest mode, which has been the staple of classic Battlefront. All the maps from the campaign are playable, plus you get Kashyyyk. Likewise, there is also a working Galactic Conquest mode, and I feel like this version with its space and ground encounters contained to a single battle would have flowed much better than Battlefront 2 with its fragmented, somewhat repetitive space battles. I also thought it was really cool that when you're playing as the Empire on Hoth, you can't actually land on Echo Base because of the shields. So instead, you've got to use the ground forces from outside the area just like they did in the movie. Several of the larger maps also allow for the fan-favorite Heroes v Villains mode, which is much further along than the older 360 build of the game. And just like that build, it has a really impressive roster of both heroes and villains from the prequels, the originals, and the EU. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's still plenty of jank here, but it's hilarious. We've got two Vaders teaming up on Anakin. Ben Kenobi's pretty spry for an older fellow. Dooku, maybe try to use some fabric softener on the cloak next time. Oh no, it's Obi-Wan. And he's doing that weird run again. See, Yoda looks fine here. Whee, look at him run. I wonder what a special move is. Oh wow. What did you fucking say to me? And so there we have it, the most complete version of Battlefront 3 that we'll probably ever get. And as I mentioned, LucasArts cancelled this game only weeks after this build. In the years since, there has been a lot of speculation over whether 3 Radical or any other developer at the time would have been able to deliver a finished bug-free version on the hardware of the time. I heard some people say that the ground-to-space combat just wasn't doable without heavy slowdown back then. Well, I decided to ask the team over at the Free Radical Archive for their take.
I think they just needed another year. An October release, like an October 2009 release, seems plausible based on what we see in the Wii. Considering like how far they'd come from March, how much of the art was done, and that it was just pretty much the game's content was complete. It was just fixing the plethora of issues, and I think the performance on an actual Wii test kit comes out to, I think, an average of about 20 frames per second. No, this was a game that was another 8 months of constant development away from being release ready.
And I think that's what makes it so bittersweet. Getting the chance to play a much more complete version of Battlefront 3 was a wonderful experience, but at the same time it was so sad because it looked so much closer to completion than ever before, and it could have been one of the best Star Wars games ever made if it just had more time. I'd like to give a huge thanks to the Free Radical Archive for both providing this build and taking the time to talk to me about it. They have spent over $3,000 of their own money to acquire this build and are going to continue to work on patching it to make it as complete an experience as possible. So any support that you could give them would be most appreciated. Links can be found in my description. Also, please make sure to leave a comment below with your thoughts on this build of Battlefront 3. Which is your favorite level and how well do you think it would have held up against other Star Wars games at the time? As always, thanks for watching. Please consider supporting me on Patreon, and a big thanks to my existing patrons. If you've enjoyed this video, then please remember to like, subscribe, and hit the bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.